Ari Shavit, leading Israeli journalist and author of the new book, My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you.
Is this your first time at the book fair?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, my first time in Miami, and I'm so pleased that I've arrived at last.
Yeah? Yeah? What do you think of it? Have you had a chance to see any of it?
Not really, but I get the vibe and I love it.
Yeah.
So, I come from a passionate, warm country, and it seems that this is a passionate, warm city. So I'm looking forward to explore it.
Yeah, you'll love it. I want to ask you, what do you mean by the triumph and tragedy of Israel?
Simple but great question. I'll begin with the tragedy. I think the tragedy we hear about all the time because we hear about the conflict. But what I do in my book is try to get to the roots of it. I don't want to get into the politics. The idea of this book is to deal with the history without writing a history book, to deal with the politics without writing a political book, but to bring it all to a human level and to create a story that would be attractive to any reader in America, not necessarily Jewish or not necessarily anyone who really cares so much about Israel, but to bring back the essential story, which is a very dramatic one. So the tragedy part, we keep talking about the occupation, the settlements, and the Kerry Initiative and all that. I try to understand how to explain in the book, and not only as a theory, but I give the stories how deep this conflict is, because it has this cultural element, historical element, the terrible tragedy of what happened to the Palestinians. So the tragedy, to say it in a line, is that you have a homeless people, the Jews, who went to their ancient homeland to create a home, a national home, and they succeeded. But in the process, another people, the Palestinians, have become homeless. And this is the tragedy, and it haunts us all. And my wish is, I really hope that Palestinians and Arabs will read the book. I think that if we have deeper understanding of one another and more empathy, each one to the other tragedy, there are no villains in this story. No one is also very powerful. This is a story of refugees, victims from all sides who found themselves caught in the conflict. That conflict is very dangerous, it's tragic. I try to bring empathy to it, fresh understanding of it, and I hope that the result of that, there will be a kind of mental process of all of us being a bit more pure in handling that. That's a tragedy. The triumph is an amazing one, and there the picture was totally lost in recent decades, because basically, as I said, you have the story of the most miserable people, definitely in the West, possibly in the world. People that have been haunted, that have been lynched, that have been persecuted. People that had a lot of talent and strength in them. But for years, for centuries, were Europe's victims. The Jews are the ultimate victims of Europe. And this, of course, came to a peak with the Holocaust. But Zionism, the people went there, my family went there before the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. But and these people went there, and rather than rather than whine, rather than cry, rather than be depressed, took responsibility over their own fate and created a man-made miracle. They really built a home for these homeless people. And this is an astounding success story. And when you look at these people, how they came from death, and to this day they are surrounded by the threat of death, and yet they live such a vivid, basically happy, good life, with amazing creativity in economy, in technology, in science, in the arts, in culture, in demography. We make a lot of babies there. We have a great nightlife. We are very sexy people. We are very sensual people, almost as the people of Miami. And all that, but imagine a Miami that has in the background a Holocaust and is surrounded by constant threat. So this is the triumph, that within tragic circumstances, our tragic past, our tragic geopolitical situation, we actually have created this great party, if you wish, a party of life. And Israel, in this sense, is a celebration of life, and my book celebrates that.
The average American who's interested, who watches CNN, reads, say the New York Times, looking and concerned about the Middle East, it seems that the Arab-Israeli conflict is intractable. because both sides are aggrieved. You have the Jews in Israel who have been subject to terrorism, but then you have the Palestinians who were dispossessed in 1948. Both sides feel righteous. Both sides feel sinned against. Where is the basis for optimism?
Again, this is a deep question. I'll tell you what my answer is. I think that one of the mistakes of good people with goodwill in this country, in Europe, and in Israel, the people who are generally on the left, generally the promoters of peace, I think their goal is a benign one, and in many ways the right one, to have a two-state solution. And their attempt to reach peace is noble, and I hail it. But if you look at the history, at the tragedy, if you look at the harsh situation, at the very brutal neighborhood we live in, our brutal history and the brutal surroundings, I think that the idea that we can have peace tomorrow, overall peace tomorrow, and end this long, complicated conflict with some ceremony on the White House lawn, I wish it's true, it would be possible. I think I'm somewhat pessimistic there. But I'm not a pessimist. I think that if we endorse a different approach, if we will try to build peace step by step, if Israel will try to end the occupation of the West Bank gradually, it cannot be done overnight, in a way that does not endanger it. If the Palestinians, with the help of the international community and Israelis, will build their own home in the West Bank, I think we can build, bit by bit, we can build a peace. It will not happen overnight, but over a long period of time, I think this is where the hope is.
You interviewed a lot of people with this book, Jews and Muslims alike. When you were on that level of the individual, did you find more basis for cooperation and identification between the two people?
In the beginning, no. Because in the beginning, when you actually when you look at the life stories, you see what people have been through and you see how difficult. You see that it's in many ways worse than what is said by the diplomats from both sides when you hear them on CNN. But at the end of the day, I am optimistic about the people because I think, definitely Israelis, I think that the impression that Israel has become so extremist is wrong. We have an extreme minority, a very dangerous one. But I think that the majority of Israelis are life-loving people. They want peace and quiet. They're not into grand ideologies. They're not that nationalistic. They're not fundamentalist. Give them a good Florida-like life and they will take it. So there is hope there if the right idea is presented to them. I want to hope. I know the Palestinians not as well as I know the Israelis, but I want to hope that at least those Palestinians living in the West Bank do want to move on. They do want a better life. And looking at the brutality in the countries surrounding us, Syria, Egypt, and so on, they realize that perhaps they might have a better life working with us rather than with some of the other people in nations in the regions that have went berserk. So yes, I think it's difficult. I think it calls for patience, for ingenuity, for creativity. But at the end of the day, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Do you have Palestinian friends?
Yes, I don't have bosom friends, but over the years, I've many Palestinians that I've known that are friends. I describe one in my book. He's an Israeli Palestinian, but this is an Arab lawyer, very talented Palestinian lawyer, whom we were active in the Israeli civil rights movement together. We were both leading a human rights organization, in a sense equivalent of the American ACLU. And I describe in the book, there is a chapter about Muhammad and me. And the difficulties we go and look at the country together, and I have my perspective, he has his perspective, which are very different. And it's troubling in many ways. Yet we have so much in common. We share democratic values, liberal values. And at the end, I tell him he falls asleep in the car, and I think about him and say, what, Muhammad, for your son and for my daughter, will we be able to move on and overcome the difficulties and the harsh past?
When I was growing up, there were 3 places in the world where the conflict seemed insoluble. Israel and Palestine, South Africa, and Northern Ireland. South Africa and Northern Ireland have gotten past their troubles.
Absolutely.
Does that give you hope for Israel?
Well, it's not that simple because it shows you that there is something about the conflict there that is more difficult than the others. I was aware of it since I grew up because there are several dimensions here. Because there is a national clash, there is a religious element, there is in a certain element, the worlds meet there. And there is then the question of dispossession or not, and occupation. So it's like 4, 5, 6 layers. It's more difficult. When I first went to Northern Ireland, when the conflict was still raging there, I noticed immediately that the gaps there between the Protestants and the Catholics, although they were deep, were not as multi-layered and multi-dimensional as ours. And yet, I think that, look, if the Germans and French, who would have thought 100 years ago that the French and German will live almost under one political union? So if that happened, and if we got over our grievances with the German, there is nothing, what happened to us because of German, old Germany, not Germany of today, we overcame that. And if these things can be overcome, I'm sure that one day, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but perhaps next week, we'll be able to overcome that.
Ari Shavit, the book is My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.